All right, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jason Q. I'm a senior managing attorney with the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Our topic today is part of our board basics training series, and we are talking about and governance committees, two committees that are so important to a lot of nonprofit boards. I'm hoping that the folks listening today are either thinking about spinning out their first committees or have already done so but want more insight and guidance on what these committees look like, what they should be doing. A few kind of housekeeping notes to get out of the way. For those of us joining live, you can get a copy of the slides. They're already preloaded for you in the GoToWebinar client. So open up that client, look for the handouts tab, and you'll be able to download a copy of the handouts there. Also, for those joining us live, I would love to take questions throughout the presentation. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the questions panel in GoToWebinar. You can type questions in during the course of the presentation. I will keep an eye on them, and I will periodically stop and answer questions as we move along. I have designed the presentation with some buffer space for questions, so please don't hesitate to put questions in. Today is more of a high-level overview, so I think if people have kind of more detailed or granular questions about how committees are working in their organization or their plans for the Finance and Governance Committee, I'd love to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So please do keep the questions coming in. If you're listening to a recorded version of the webinar, the slides will also be available on the webpage where you accessed the webinar. Alrighty. Also, last bit of housekeeping, let me just tell you a little bit more about the DC Bar Pro Bono Center for those who are new to our organization. We are a legal services nonprofit organization, and part of what we do is that we have a nonprofit legal assistance program. The nonprofit legal assistance program does a lot of things. We host legal clinics and other brief advice services where nonprofit leaders and representatives can talk with volunteer attorneys for free and with very low barrier to access. We sponsor trainings like today's webinar and podcasts and newsletters and other resources on real world legal issues relevant to nonprofits. We call the area of law we work in business law. So it's any legal area that's relevant to nonprofits as tax exempt organizations and just as businesses. So employment law, intellectual property, risk management, we cover it all. We provide all of these written resources and our archive training sessions here on our website, lawhelp.org/dc/NPSB. I encourage everyone to visit that site, become familiar with it, bookmark it. Our upcoming events are also listed on that website, so it's a great place to be familiar with and to check out periodically. And finally, we have a nonprofit match program that matches DC serving nonprofit organizations with pro bono volunteer counsel to help on larger legal projects. That can include, a big corporate governance overhaul, maybe revising an employment law manual, employee handbook or something like that. Any larger legal matter that can't be served in our brief advice services. If you qualify, you might want to check out our pro bono match program. All right, let's get into today's webinar. As I said, this is part of our Board Basics webinar series. I have a list of other Board Basics webinars here. The purpose of Board Basics is to provide sort of a high level, bite-sized overview of really relevant legal topics for folks who are serving on nonprofit boards and also for executive directors and other staff that interface with nonprofit boards. So, we see we have stuff about managing conflicts of interest. We have mechanical things like taking minutes and voting and taking actions, calling meetings, the whole shebang. So we've actually already done a high-level webinar on the role of board and advisory committees. I have a link to that in the presentation. I do encourage folks to check out that webinar if they haven't looked at it already. Today's webinar is going to be more focused on finance and governance committees, whereas that webinar is more of a high-level overview of sort of how committees work at a more basic kind of legal level. Okay, let me start though. Having said that, I will do a little bit of background on sort of how committees interface with the whole board and how they interact with the board's fiduciary duties more generally. So let's zoom all the way out, forget about committees for now, and talk about the board's role at a high level. So a reminder, or refresher for everyone, nonprofit organizations are legal entities that are authorized to carry out their tax-exempt or charitable or educational mission. 501c3 nonprofits in particular have a special tax status. They receive a subsidy from the public in the form of tax deductions for donors and also tax exemptions for the organization. So these are really significant and unique tax free. Unlike most business entities, you don't pay tax on the donations and grants and program income and other tax exempt income that you generate. So that's pretty significant. In return, they are subject to additional operational oversight related and reporting requirements. And one of these core requirements are that nonprofit corporations are required to have a board of directors that collectively manages the organization. The board is responsible for the overall management of the organization and generally for ensuring that the organization is run in the public interest, that it's only run in pursuit of its tax mission, that its funds aren't being used to enrich private individuals, and that the funds are being managed appropriately. And this is going to be really relevant when we're talking about the Finance Committee in a bit. Nonprofit directors, for their part, are subject to heightened, legally recognized and enforceable duties that we call fiduciary duties, which govern their management of the nonprofit. We have a recent webinar in our Board Basics series, fiduciary duties, what they are, and how practically they're relevant to sort of your day-to-day work as a nonprofit director. Just as a summary, in DC, we recognize a duty of care, which is sort of like a competence or a quality control kind of duty. It means that when you're serving as a nonprofit director or an officer of the organization, that you have to be engaged, informed. You can't just put your head in the sand and let the organization run itself around you. You really have to be an active leader and an overseer of the organization. That's the duty of care. We have a duty of loyalty, which is around conflicts of interest and making sure that you're always acting in the organization's best interest and not in your personal interest or in the interest of another party. We have a duty of obedience, which is about a duty to always abide by the laws and policies of the nonprofit and also broadly of the government and of the IRS that are relevant to nonprofits, and also a duty to inform, which is a narrower duty around sort of reporting up issues or malfeasance that you discover in the course of your service as a nonprofit director or officer, up through kind of a chain reporting or chain of command within the nonprofit, and not just sitting on that information and not doing anything with it. These duties are going to be relevant to our conversation today. Again, that duty of care component, super relevant to finance committees. You'll see the duty of obedience pop up when we talk about governance committees. So we talked about duties. Where it's really relevant for our discussion of committees is this idea of delegation, right? So we'll start with a small or young or startup nonprofit. Often these organizations are volunteer run, they don't have staff, and the board is really the workhorse of the organization. So we call these working boards that perform some or all of the organization's management and administrative duties. So that's sort of one side of the spectrum, really young organizations with working boards. As nonprofits mature, they can hire staff and contractors, and many of these management duties are delegated to those staff or to those third-party professionals. This allows the board to focus more on its core duties around governance, strategy setting, fundraising, policy making, and oversight. So that's the evolution of nonprofits as they grow, as they get more money, as they hire more staff. We see a transition from a working board into more of a governance-focused board, a strategic board. Another sort of element in this equation are the creation of committees. It's another way that the whole board can delegate some of its more specialized tasks or oversight areas. The board will create a committee. There's two options here. It can create a board committee, which has final decision-making authority, just like the board does within its smaller realm of authority. If you have a board committee, because it's authorized to make decisions the same way that the whole board can, you can only have directors on your board committee, and we need full board approval when we're creating and staffing board committees. All right, so an executive committee is a good example of a board committee. An executive committee is a subset of the board that can make decisions in between board meetings. They might meet more regularly. So that kind of committee, because it's actually making board level decisions, it needs to be only staffed by directors, and we need kind of a higher threshold when we're creating and staffing those committees. That is in contrast with non-board committees. These can be advisory committees or ad hoc committees. These are committees that don't make final board level decisions. All they do is they generate proposals or recommendations or reports for the full board to then approve, or they perform non-board tasks that could otherwise be delegated to staff. So when we have a non-board committee, we can have non-directors serving and voting on those committees. And the approval threshold for creating and staffing them is a little bit lower. So those are the two flavors of committees that we can create. The two committees that we'll be focusing on today, the Finance and the Governance Committee, you see them come in sort of both flavors. There are some finance committees that are board committees that do take kind of final action on certain items. They might approve a policy, or they might, make some other sort of smaller finance related decision. A lot of finance committees are actually non-board committees, even if they're generally only staffed by directors. They make recommendations to the full board, but they don't take final board decision on any discrete matter. I like that model personally. I think having a finance committee that is really advisory, that's sort of performing some legwork on the ground level, but leaving those big decisions to the full board, that's a better model for most finance committees. It also allows staff and non-director participation on those committees in a way that you wouldn't be able to do if you had a board committee. On the side of the governance committee, I see those as being board committees quite often, because the focus of the governance committee is really on developing and optimizing the board itself. So it makes more sense in that situation to have only directors on that committee, and having it be a board committee means it's a little bit more nimble and can make some final decisions without having to run everything by the board itself. Anyways, we'll dive into that a little bit more when we go into each of these two committees. I just wanted to sketch out that board committee versus non-board committee distinction in the context of today's conversation. Whether we're delegating to staff or to these committees, every director on the board continues to have a fiduciary obligation to at least oversee their operations and to address any issues or deficiencies that they discover. So, your fiduciary duty of care doesn't evaporate once you start delegating some of these functions to staff or to committees, but it does look different. It becomes more about making sure that you're receiving information from the committees, that you're reading the reports that are coming out of committees or coming from staff, and then performing your sort of oversight functions based on that information that you're receiving. Okay, a bit more about committees. So your organization's bylaws will stipulate whether and how you create committees within the organization. So the first place that people should be looking when they're thinking about committees in their organization are their bylaws. Again, we have that previous webinar that talks about these mechanics in a little bit more detail. Most bylaws, including our template bylaws when we're advising new nonprofits, give the board a very high degree of flexibility to create and dissolve committees as needed. So in our template bylaws, we actually don't require the organization to have any committees at any particular time. Instead, all we do is we have a provision that empowers the board to create board committees when it needs to, and to create non-board advisory committees when they need to. And we just leave it at that, because we think that that level of flexibility is optimal for most organizations, and especially for young organizations that don't exactly know when they're going to need a particular committee, or when they even have the bandwidth to staff and sustain a particular committee. So our approach is to have it be as flexible as possible. Other bylaws and other organizations might require the existence of certain standing or constitutional committees at all times. So the bylaws themselves will say this organization shall have an executive committee, this organization shall have a finance committee or a governance committee. And so the committees are baked in to the bylaws of those organizations. And that approach can work as well. There's a certain degree of clarity that comes out of having committees baked right into your bylaws. It gives everyone sort of a goal when it comes to recruiting directors, not only to serve on the board, but to make sure that the committees are appropriately staffed. And I think it works a lot better with sort of more mature organizations that understand their pipeline of directors and are confident that they can sustain those committees going forward. So benefits of creating committees at a high level include, the big one is specialization and focus. Committees have a narrower focus. They have a target issue area, a target list of tasks, and that can really leverage the expertise of members with matching skills or professional backgrounds. So when we're talking about our finance committee, that's a great place where your CPAs or your people with sort of experience running nonprofits or other businesses can sort of huddle and use their skills most effectively. Committees also expand the bandwidth. This is sort of obvious, but they meet outside of your regular board meetings, and so they can meet more often. They can just be a place where directors expend more hours, serving the organization and applying their skills and expertise. And because they're smaller, they can be more nimble and responsive to developments within their purview. One example I'll use today is a governance committee. One of its core jobs is to identify and nominate candidates for upcoming vacancies on the board or on your committees. That can be really time intensive around certain periods of the year, and so it's good to have a committee that can call meetings and do interviews and do all that work in a really nimble fashion without having to rope in the entire board. That's a great benefit. The kind of flip side of that is that committees are really good at redistributing workload. They do a lot of the legwork, and they can allow the board to focus more on strategy and fundraising and planning and all the kind of core governance duties of a more mature board. And finally, committees are a great opportunity for broader engagement, especially those non-board, more advisory type committees. They can be a great opportunity for non-directors to become involved in the leadership of your organization. So that could include staff, but that can include, community members or volunteers who don't want to be full-on directors on the full board, but still want to become involved. Well, maybe they can sit on your finance committee if they have a finance background, or maybe they can sit on your programs committee or other committees and still, play a part without all the responsibilities and commitment of being a full director. So this kind of conversation around creating committees will really depend on the size of your organization, the size of your board, and really the availability of expertise, whether that be financial expertise, other expertise, and availability to kind of serve on committees and to serve as chairs of committees. So that's really the limiting factor. A lot of people ask me, when should I create a committee? And I usually kind of flip it around and say, first of all, can you create committees? Do you have a large enough board? Do you have enough people to serve as chairs? Let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's make sure that the whole board is in a good place. We want to probably have at least 5 people on the board before it makes sense to really spin out larger committees, because if you only have a 3-person board, basically everyone on your board is going to be on all of your committees. So that could still be a way to focus the work of the board in a way, but I think committees work better on slightly larger boards where it really makes sense to start optimizing and start to use that specialization, use those special backgrounds in a more focused way. Some basic components of committees when we're ready to launch them. I'll talk about 3 things we should have lined up before we're launching our committees out into the world. One thing is that we want to have a charter for your committees. So a charter is a freestanding document that they're sort of like mini bylaws for the committee. They lay out how the committee will be run and operated, expanding on the rules already provided in the bylaws. So for example, in our template bylaws that we use for most organizations, the bylaws have a couple of lines about how the committees are supposed to work. They address, for example, that the chair of the committees will be appointed by the chair of the board, for example, and they might say that the committees will, generally speaking, act by majority vote, the same way that the board does, that they'll keep minutes. And so they'll have some kind of high level rules for how the committees will work. And then it's the charter that's going to provide more detailed rules. So it's going to have usually a section talking about the purpose and the authority of the committee. It'll have a section detailing who gets to sit on the committee. So how many people do we want? What are their qualifications? How are they selected? and this refers to both the chair and also the individual members of the committee. Then it'll usually list out the sort of duties and responsibilities of the committee, and I'll show you what that looks like in the context of both finance and governance committees in a moment. And then usually there'll be provisions addressing sort of the more mechanical or procedural aspects of the committee. So meetings, how often are we going to meet? Where do we meet? What notice is required for meetings? Who's going to take minutes? Who is responsible for reporting out of the committee? Do we have a staff representative or staff liaisons on the committee? You know, staff people who are supposed to be attending all these meetings in addition to the director members. How is the committee evaluated, etc. So that's all going to be addressed in your charter. It's like a mini bylaws. There are a lot of good template committee charters floating around the internet. We don't currently have any in-house, but if you need a connection to a template committee charter, reach out and let us know. For example, Stanford Law School actually has a really great library that one of their clinics has created of template nonprofit governance documents, including template charters for most core committees. That's a good place that I like to look, but there are other resources available as well. Okay, a second component of any committee is to identify and empower the chair of the committee. So the chair is the individual who leads the committee. Again, their appointment or selection is usually addressed in the bylaws, or you'll have to address it in your committee charter. And the typical duties really include serving as the main point person between the committee and the full board, and also between the committee and the staff. So if a staff member wants to present to the committee or wants to ask the committee to do something, it's important to know who to go through, and that's usually the chair. Same with the full board. If the full board is receiving a report from the committee or is asking the committee to do something, that's usually the chair that's sort of tapped in those situations. The chair is responsible for the mechanics of meetings, so setting agendas, providing notices, preparing materials, and actually leading or facilitating the meetings. They should supervise the creation of minutes and other records. They don't necessarily have to take all the minutes, but they should make sure that someone is responsible for taking minutes. It's very important to take minutes of your committee meetings the same way that you would take minutes of your regular board meetings. And finally, the chair is responsible for kind of keeping the committee as a whole and its individual members accountable to work plans and assignments that come out of the committee. Speaking of work plans, that's my third sort of component that I think all committees should have eventually. So this is an annual list of tasks and goals for each committee that's developed by the committee in collaboration with staff and key officers, like the chair of the board. He's usually involved in developing and approving work plans. If you have a governance committee, the governance committee or the chair of the governance committee is usually responsible for helping to develop of other committees. We'll get to that in a minute. So anyways, it's a list of tasks and goals throughout the year, and you should link that to a calendar or a timeline to map out how and when those tasks will be performed over the course of the year. So really useful to develop work plans every year. It gives focus to the committee. It gives notice to individual members of what they're getting into when they join a committee, and it just helps keep everyone accountable. It also keeps the committee from sort of expanding the scope of its project over the course of a year in a way that might not be strategically useful to the organization, in a way that might overlap with the work. Setting out work plans in advance, we ensure that things are run more efficiently, and we reduce the chance of those sort of redundancies. Okay, so today's presentation will focus on finance and governance committees. I think that these two committees are useful and should be seriously considered for just about every nonprofit once it gets to a point where, again, it has that the size and stability in their full board where it makes sense to start spinning out specialized bodies. We're not going to talk about all of these other committees that exist in the nonprofit world. We have a separate webinar on executive committees. If you're interested in spinning out an executive committee, look for that in our resource library. I will touch on audit and investment committees briefly in the context of the finance committee. And then there are all these other committees that we just don't have time to get into today, but I wanted to put them here on the slide to remind folks that they're out there. The two at the end, I definitely won't be talking about, but I encourage everyone to continue thinking about as they're strategizing around committees. So one are these purely advisory committees or councils. These are a great place to get maybe subject matter experts involved or community members involved, or representatives from your client or constituent population. So always remember the option of creating sort of these fully advisory committees that are really meant for engagement. Sort of youth councils are another popular body here. Committees themselves can be a really good way of integrating and engaging with the community and having their input fed into the work of the board as a whole. And I'll mention ad hoc committees. So the difference between an ad hoc committee and a standing committee is that ad hoc committees have a particular project or a pre-specified timeline. And when they complete the project or when the timeline expires, the committee dissolves automatically. Ad hoc committees, you'll see them sometimes for strategic planning, or if the organization is responding to a particular need, like we need to hire a new executive director, so there might be an executive search ad hoc committee. So these are very useful. They're not going to be within the scope of what we're talking about today. Okay, let's get into the two committees that we'll be focusing on. I'll start with the Finance Committee. Again, zooming out a little bit before we dive too deeply, we want to remind everyone that the entire board, has fiduciary responsibilities related to finance. So even when we're delegating these functions to staff or to committees or to other third parties, I just want to lay out what the whole board's sort of core finance functions are. First is to ensure financial sustainability for the organization. So this is reviewing high-level trends affecting the organization's revenue and business plan, exploring potential new revenue streams, actively engaging in fundraising and development efforts, and assessing financial risks and liabilities. So even if you have a finance committee, I think a core job of the finance committee is to help identify financial trends or risks on the horizon that might affect the organization and allow the organization to be proactive in pivoting or redeveloping its financial strategy in response to these financial realities. Budgeting is an important and critical function for the whole board. So while budgets can be drafted by staff and maybe developed within a finance committee, the whole board should really influence and approve the final budget in line with strategic priorities and its own financial risk analysis. An important role of the board and of having a big diverse group of people on your board is you have different perspectives when it comes to budgeting, when it comes to spending, when it comes to risk, when it comes to revenue. Okay, receiving and reviewing financial reports is always a critical function for the full board. The board should be receiving a financial report at least every meeting, ideally with written reports provided on a more monthly basis. This allows the board to investigate trends and issues related to sort of, revenue, spending, budget to actual performance, etc. It encourages directors to develop basic financial literacy, and staff should explore the use of dashboards and other strategies to prevent this financial information to the full board. So even if we have finance staff, even if we have a finance committee, reviewing financial reports should always be a core function of the full board at full board meetings. Establishing financial policies, really important to draft and implement high-level policies to guide decision-making and to safeguard your resources. We'll get to that more in a minute. And ensuring legal compliance, like developing awareness of legal requirements, to either delegate or take on compliance responsibilities. All right, so these are board level financial functions. They're always going to be there, but we'll then focus on the way that the finance committee can focus and refine some of these functions and make it easier for the full board to do its job. So as soon as practical, we do recommend that boards spin off a finance committee to specialize in financial governance. Ooh, that all came at once. This can either be a board or advisory committee, as I mentioned up front. Benefits to being a non-board committee include that it's always running major decisions by the full board and allowing every director to exercise their individual fiduciary duties with respect to financial oversight. And it's also a good opportunity to involve non-directors as participants or voting members. So as we flagged, delegating to these kind of more granular ground level duties to the finance committee allows the full board to operate in a more strategic and supervisory role. And a key job, I think, of the finance committee is to research and frame strategic questions around finances for the full board. So kind of researching the financial situation of the organization, looking at opportunities or pivot points or different ways of doing things and framing all of that for the board to then have a discussion and to make a final decision. Common questions involve, if we have surplus funds, how to invest those surpluses. If we have a revenue shortfall or financial risks affecting the organization, how are we going to respond? Are we going to respond by beefing up other sort of fundraising opportunities, or is it going to be about cutting spending or cutting programs? Is it a mix of both? So those are sort of the high level decisions that the finance committee can help frame for the full board. Just like I mentioned with staff doing, the committee itself can invest in strategies to present financial information to the board in a kind of an accessible, user-friendly format, acknowledging that the folks on the finance committee tend to have more financial expertise than folks on the full board. So how can the finance committee translate financial information and a financial situation to the board? And that can sometimes involve literally using pictures, visuals, and graphs and charts are useful. And there are a lot of dashboards and other tools that exist in the world that folks can use to help present financial information to the whole board. I'm going to go now into some of the specific duties of the finance committee. So again, we're taking a leadership role, read the board's financial functions. So, okay, so let's talk about some of these duties. One of them is around budgeting. So again, drafting that annual budget, but also multi-year financial plans. What this looks like will really depend on how staff is involved in your organization. So if you have a finance person or a finance department, they'll often be doing the initial job of sort of creating budgets with other staff and with other departments. If you don't have that robust finance operation at the staff level, the finance committee itself is often actively involved in drafting the annual budgets. Same thing with multi-year financial plans. That can be in a larger organization with more staff, more of a staff duty, but it can also be more of a core duty of the finance committee. And again, we'll take these budgets and financial plans and then present them to the full board for discussion and for ultimate adoption. The finance committee should be reviewing and monitoring its internal financial reports, so quarterly and even monthly financial reports. The members of the finance committee should be just taking a look at these reports, making sure there aren't any worrying trends or numbers that they see, asking questions if there are things worthy of discussion, etc. Kind of an aspect of that, more detailed, monitoring cash flow and budget actual performance, using all this information to identify financial trends and proposing responses. This is an important one. It's monitoring investment performance and setting goals with respect to your investments and your reserves. So for organizations that do have surplus or investable funds, there should be a body in charge of overseeing how those funds are invested, what's going to a reserve, what's going into more of a long-term investment vehicle, what's if you have an endowment, you definitely should be supervising that and how that's being invested. So for organizations with really robust investments, we can create a separate investment committee to handle it. For organizations with more modest investments or more modest reserve, that can be a role of the finance committee. Any other key financial metrics that are relevant to organization, definitely within the purview of the finance committee. Another critical job of the finance committee is around financial reporting. So the finance committee should be assisting with the Form 990 preparation and other outward-facing financial reports. Again, with respect to the Form 990, what that looks like depends on the staff operation at your organization. If you have finance staff, they'll usually prepare the first draft of the 990, and the role of the committee is just to kind of review and oversee that document. For organizations that don't have that robust finance operation, finance committee or the treasurer might be more actively involved in actually drafting that report. Advising and supporting the organization's finance department in other ways if they need advice on sort of accounting practices or anything else that you might have expertise at in the finance committee. Supporting staff is also something you should be doing. And then we'll get to this later, but drafting, implementing, and enforcing financial policies is a huge part of the finance committee's role. Those policies can sort of start and grow in the finance committee. The actual legwork of drafting the language and thinking about what should be in the policies can start in the committee, and then those completed drafts can go to the full board for review and for approval. Okay, so those are sort of core duties of the finance committee. I do want to spend one slide talking about those smaller organizations with more of a working board model and no dedicated finance staff. In these organizations, the finance committee is itself going to be more of a working committee, and it's going to be doing more to support or supplement staff in managing day-to-day opportunities, especially in areas where staff could use more support because there's more risk or sensitivity. So some of these examples, as I've already mentioned, preparing interim financial reports and internal financial reviews or audits. We'll talk about audits in a second, but basically, if your organization doesn't undergo an audit, it can be still useful for you to review your financial reports and perform sort of an internal audit. So that can be something that the finance committee really oversees and takes a leadership role on. Separate kind of issue, but maintaining your local tax exemptions or your corporate status can be something that the finance committee supports. Managing and accounting for donor restricted funds is a really critical finance function that the committee can help support when you don't have a lot of staff who has maybe experience in this area. So if you have restrictions on some or a large proportion of your funds, those restrictions need to be honored, and that affects how your accounting system operates. So making sure that your organization is capable of doing that. All the financial work around grants, grant procurement, management, compliance. For smaller organizations, the finance committee can really lend some expertise and labor in terms of helping with those processes. Monitoring activities with special reporting and compliance requirements. Here I'm thinking about, for example, activities that generate unrelated business income. We have a separate webinar on that if you'd like to learn more. Programs that provide cash assistance or scholarships, programs that operate internationally. All of these sorts of programs will trigger enhanced reporting requirements on your 990 and in other contexts. And so it's really important that leaders in the organization are sort of preemptively gathering the sort of data and also the narrative descriptions that they're going to need to perform that reporting down the road. And again, if you're a smaller organization with like one executive director, the finance committee can help support that reporting function. And finally, compliance issues around fundraising and charitable solicitation. So, around 40 states require a special license or registration in order to fundraise in those states. Complying with those requirements can be a real burden, and in a small organization, the finance committee can help identify which states you might need to register in and what those compliance steps might look like. In terms of fundraising, things like donor acknowledgement notices and other requirements, that's something the finance committee can support on. So let me talk also about finance versus audit committees. So for organizations that do not undergo an audit or have an audit committee, the finance committee has a whole new set of responsibilities, and that's responsibilities around compliance, risk management, and setting internal controls. All right, so there's this critical range of duties around risk management, internal controls, making sure that your funds aren't misappropriated or misused. That in a large organization that has an audit committee, that is traditionally an audit committee function. If you don't have an audit committee because you don't undergo an audit, that function needs to also fall on a finance committee or another committee if you can delegate it somewhere else. All right, so as I said, not all organizations need to undergo an audit, and there is no overarching legal requirement that dictates when you should undergo an audit, but some requirements might flow from your individual grant or contract agreements, from your need to get charitable solicitation requirements. So for example, if you want to get a charitable solicitation license to Virginia and you're over $1 million, you need to get an audit. In Maryland, it's $750,000, then you need to get an audit. And there are also federal grant requirements that sort of come with audit requirements attached. For organizations that do undergo an audit, in that case, our goal is to have a separate audit and finance committees, two separate committees, an audit and a finance committee, with as few overlapping members as possible. The idea there is that the audit committee is really supposed to be floating over the organization, sort of making sure that everyone's complying, making sure that there's no financial mismanagement. And that can include auditing the finance committee, or at least auditing the work of the finance committee or the individuals who can sit on the finance committee, including the treasurer, and other individuals. So that's our sort of goal. When we're a large organization, we undergo an audit, we can sustain two committees of two separate committees. We'll have a finance committee that's really focused on financial monitoring and oversight and governance, and an audit committee that's more focused on internal controls, compliance, risk management. Alrighty. This is sort of a chart that's laying out how those responsibilities flow into each other. So on the far left side, we have the core responsibilities of the finance committee. So, this will be a summary of kind of what we've talked about already: assisting with budget creation, assisting with financial reporting, reviewing organizations' financial performance, advising on financial developments, drafting and implementing policies. Okay. And then on the far right side, I want to point out the core responsibilities of the audit committee. And so this is when you undergo an audit, the audit committee is going to hire the audit firm, oversee the firm's work, engage with the auditors, oversee audit results, and then if there are issues with the audit committee is going to liaise with the board about those audit concerns and make recommendations. In the middle is this realm of compliance, risk management, and internal controls related duties. And those are going to drift depending on whether you have an audit committee or not. If you don't have an audit committee, those will be finance committee responsibilities. If you do have an audit committee, those will be audit committee responsibilities. So I want to focus on those. Those include overseeing your system of internal controls. So these are policies to prevent fraud or financial mismanagement. Really basic ones might include, requiring multiple signatures for large checks or expenditures, having, people who are reviewing financial statements and not just completely relying on your bookkeeper. So sort of practices like that. The audit committee can also often take that role of drafting the Form 990 and other government reports because they're engaged with the audit. Otherwise that should be, as we said, a finance committee job. Serving as a body to receive reports or complaints of financial errors or financial mismanagement, really important function. Assessing the organization's compliance with just laws and policies, really important responsibility. And engaging in risk mitigation, risk assessment, and purchasing adequate insurance for the organization. That is a job that somebody should be doing that can often lie in the finance committee. And again, once you have an audit committee, it can sort of drift out and transfer over to the audit committee. So, I think there's a lot on this slide. I think folks should sort of save it and keep it in mind. It's a good summary of both the finance committee's duties and these sort of drifting risk and compliance related duties. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about staffing your finance committee. A key benefit of having a finance committee is that you can focus the time and energy of directors with financial backgrounds in that committee. We want to ensure that members of the committee have finance and business administration skills and financial independence for the organization. The treasurer is almost always the chair, and then it's usually a pretty small committee, 3 to 6 members. That's just a function of organizations generally not having a ton of people with finance background on the board. So, that's usually why it's a little bit smaller, and that's fine. Finance-focused staff, your executive director, if you have some sort of operations person or even a chief financial officer, they should certainly be engaged with the finance committee and attending meetings. But that doesn't mean that they should be voting members. There's a lot of conflict of interest concerns that come from staff voting in a finance committee. So they should be participants, staff liaisons, staff representatives, but should not be voting members. And the committee should also have a good practice of meeting an executive session when appropriate. So executive sessions when the committee meets without staff and other non-members on the committee. This is a good way to make sure that you're having candid conversations about the performance of staff. That's hard to do when staff are in the room. So just a good procedural tip there. And again, the finance committee is a good opportunity to involve non-director volunteers if you can find them. Again, if there's someone in the community who is a CPA or who has the right background and they want to support the organization, but they don't want to fully be on the board and have to attend board meetings and donate and fundraise and do all that stuff, the finance committee is a good way of involving those individuals. In addition to overseeing the finances and setting strategy, drafting and implementing financial policies is another key job of the finance committee. I have a link here here to some external resources with some master compilations of template financial policies for people who are looking for them. But this is a way that the committee can engage in governance without having to address everything on a day-to-day or case-by-case basis. It's more about setting policies for how the organization works going forward. We're not going to spend a ton of time focusing on policies, but I'll list out some of the common policies that are managed or overseen by the Finance Committee. We have our conflict of interest policy, whistleblower policies, document retention. Your accounting manual is something that the Finance Committee can either draft or provide some guidance on. Again, those internal controls to reduce the risk of mismanagement and misappropriation. A written gift acceptance policy is really useful for dictating what sorts of gifts and donations the organization will accept without any questions, and what sorts of gifts or donations might require some approval or some additional thinking. For organizations that have paid executives, an executive compensation policy that regularly reviews that compensation and ensures that it's not excessive compensation is important from a legal compliance standpoint. And for folks who do have reserves, investments, endowments, there should be policies sort of guiding how all of those funds are managed. There are statutory guidelines and requirements around how nonprofits invest their institutional funds. And so we want to make sure that we have policies that cover those topics. Okay. I'm looking at questions. I don't see questions in the chat yet. Keep them coming if you have them. But we'll use the rest of our time to talk about the second committee that we care about in today's presentation, which is the Governance Committee. So just a high-level intro, the Governance Committee is focused on the organization's leadership and governance infrastructure. These are the people, policies, and practices that relate to your board, officers, and committees. Sometimes the Governance Committee, you'll hear it referred to as the Board Development Committee or the Nominating Committee. I like the term Governance Committee because it's a little broader, especially a term like Nominating Committee. I think that's a little bit too narrow for what the Governance Committee should really be working on, and we'll talk about that distinction in a moment. By focusing on these critical tasks, the Governance Committee can make sure that critical functions are performed. And so I use that example of nominating new board members. That's a really intensive seasonal task. It makes more sense for that kind of thing to happen in a committee than at the full board. If your organization doesn't have a governance committee, it's still really useful to designate someone as your sort of chief governance officer to focus on governance related responsibilities. There's a linked article here about what that officer position looks like. But my point here is that if you don't have a governance committee, and most nonprofits don't, it's still important to sort of think about these governance related responsibilities and to make someone responsible and accountable for them. And so I'm going to go and list out some of what those governance related responsibilities are. They're generally organized into 3 buckets. We have responsibilities related to personnel and nominations. We have responsibilities related to training, evaluation, and improvement of governance processes. And we have responsibilities related to the organization's governing documents and policies. Let's start with personnel and nominations. This is sort of the traditional focus of the Governance Committee, and will sort of practically take up a lot of your time and energy. So this can involve identifying, screening, and recruiting candidates to fill incoming board vacancies. It can involve zooming out a little bit and assessing the skills composition of the board and identifying gaps or goals for future board recruitment. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it's looking at the skills, backgrounds, qualifications, professional backgrounds, resources, and independence of your board, and asking, where do we need additional skills? Where do we need additional representation? Speaking of representation, also identifying needs with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So making sure that we have good representation on our board, representation in terms of the broader community, but also representation in terms of key demographics or stakeholders, and making sure that those voices are on the board. That's an important role of the Governance Committee. So that's all about the board. 2 more points. Another important role of the Governance Committee is to identify and cultivate a leadership pipeline for board officer positions and for committee chair positions, and also committee chair memberships. So, making sure that we have candidates for board chair, for treasurer, for secretary, for, chair of the Finance Committee, making sure that that leadership pipeline is robust and sort of tapping prospective candidates and letting them know that they should think about running for those positions, that's an important aspect of this personnel and nominations function. And then that last point for folks with CEOs and other executive staff, if you don't have a separate personnel committee or executive compensation committee, a lot of those functions around executive staff can fall in the governance committee as well. So recruiting, assessing, compensating, and succession planning around the CEO should be somebody's job, and that is often a job in the governance committee. Alrighty, let's see here. Okay, so that's on the personnel side. Let's talk about training, evaluation, and improvement. So the core of this is to really coordinate the training and onboarding program for new directors and committee members, making sure that when folks join the organization, they're learning about the organization and also what you expect from them in their role. That can also include continuing education for board members after they join the organization. It involves overseeing a self-evaluation process for the board and for your committees and making recommendations for improvement based on those evaluations. Oops, we'll just drop it all. And it's about monitoring committee performance and making recommendations around your committee structure. We'll get to some of these points again in a future slide. The final bucket is around governing documents and policies. So these are things like board manuals, a board code of ethics, job descriptions for your board and officer positions, and other government-related policies. Also, it's useful to create a platform like an online board portal or a binder, if you want to be old school, to store and disseminate all these documents and to use them in your onboarding and training process. So those are sort of documents and policies that the governance committee itself can develop. That second bullet point is about reviewing and recommending amendments to your existing governing documents, your core governing documents. These are your bylaws and your articles. They can also include governance policies like your conflict of interest policy, whistleblower policy, other policies, committee charters that we talked about, those work plans, etc. So those we should be touching a little less often. Take a leadership role in making sure that they are reviewed periodically. I'm asked a lot, how often should we review our bylaws? How often should we review our articles? That there's no sort of one size fits all answer there. The frame that I would look at it from is that your governing documents, like your articles and your bylaws and your policies, should always be consistent with how your organization actually runs and the needs that your organization actually has. So if your nonprofit has gone through a period of rapid expansion or growth, or if you've taken on new programs, if your mission statement has changed, that is usually a good time to review your articles and your bylaws to make sure that the realities of your organization are consistent with what you have on paper. You should also definitely be reviewing articles and bylaws when the relevant laws affecting nonprofits change. So if we have big developments at the IRS level or in DC in 2010, for example, we had a really big statutory overhaul of our nonprofit code. That's a good time to review your governance policies and your governing documents as well. So there's no set timeline, but that's sort of an important strategic question for the governance committee is it time for us to look at our bylaws and our policies again? Should we be doing an update or an assessment? And that's something that we assist with all the time at the Pro Bono Center. It's with organizations that haven't updated their policies in a long time and want some help in making sure that they're up to date and also relevant and useful for the organization as it exists today. And finally, there's that compliance role, ensuring that the board complies with IRS rules and regulations and with local nonprofit codes. All right, so these are the three kind of big buckets for the governance committee, all around personnel and nominating, and then these elements involving training and evaluation and your governing documents and policies. I want to dive a little bit deeper into a few of those issues with the couple of minutes we have left. So when we're looking at personnel and nominations, a concept you'll see over and over again is doing a skills assessment or a skills matrix, right? Governance committees should ensure that the board include the fullest possible range of relevant skills, backgrounds, and professional capacities. That's important for ensuring that the board can effectively support staff, effectively make decisions, and support other specialized committees, like, for example, your finance committee. You need to have those 3 to 6 finance background people there if you're going to really staff a robust committee. So that's an important kind of assessment to do for the organization. I was reading an article on BoardSource a few days ago, and they did a survey called Leading with Intent. And one thing that they find is that boards often overstress finding folks with kind of fundraising backgrounds or development backgrounds or who are themselves able to bring resources into the organization. They're really focused on resource generation and maybe not putting enough attention on developing this like robust range of skills and backgrounds on the board for a more kind of functional reason. So, some of these core skills and backgrounds can include definitely finance background, fundraising development, legal, those are classic, organizational leadership, so people with executive director experience or other leadership experience. But then there are all of these other sort of business needs that affect some or all nonprofits. And it's useful to the extent possible to get folks with those backgrounds on there. Something that I think about a lot is technology. I don't think nonprofits are doing a great job of ensuring that they have some technical expertise on their board to identify opportunities to integrate or improve the way that technology is used in the organization. A lot of folks don't have a full IT department or a tech person, so the board is a really good place to generate those insights and those ideas. That's just an example. And those last few points, really important to have folks on your board who understand your client or constituent population or have experience as a member of that population, and also really important to have some subject matter experts, in your organization's area of focus. Other things to consider when you're doing your skills assessment is the extent of your director's connections with key stakeholders. So, government connections or connections with potential funders or partner organizations, and also the ability of your directors, of course, to give or obtain key resources. So this skills assessment can occur in the context of your board's annual evaluation process. With boards that I've been involved in, as we're doing our self-evaluation, we're also listing our skills and backgrounds and helping to feed into then a skills matrix that's used to map out what we have on the board and what we might be missing. And so that should be all part of the evaluation and assessment process. I also want to take a second to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to start out by saying that this should not be a governance committee only issue, that DEI commitments should really flow from the whole board, but the governance committee can often play a really critical role in implementing and advancing specific DEI goals. And this is especially true with orgs that don't have a standing or an ad hoc DEI committee. In a lot of those cases, the governance committee is the most germane place to kind of really pursue actionable steps on DEI goals. Of course, when we're talking about DEI, we can include multiple axes of diversity, including race, age, geography, lived experience, and we should be focusing on recruitment and retention, but also inclusion and advancing an equity lens with the folks that are already on our board or in the room. Importantly, the governance committee should consider how DEI interfaces with other governance considerations. So I'll throw out some examples here. Meeting processes that are very formal, that use Robert's rules or parliamentary procedure, can those sometimes be a barrier to including a diverse range of folks on your board, including people who don't have experience working in those really formalized settings? That's a question that I'm asking clients all the time nowadays. Are strict financial expectations or requirements, sort of give and get requirement? Are those requirements calibrated in a way to include people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different professional backgrounds? Are our training and orientation materials sensitive to DEI issues? So these are really good issues to hash out in the governance committee. They're right up the alley of the governance committee. And people probably are well aware by now, but DEI is critical on nonprofit boards because it's critical for fostering community trust and understanding between our nonprofit and the communities that we serve. There's a lot of good social science research out there that diverse teams are themselves more effective, that they're more creative, they're better at problem solving, and DEI is now just so important to external stakeholders, funders, donors, third-party evaluators, volunteers, staff. I serve on, for example, the Center for Nonprofit Advancement's Board Leadership Award Committee. And when we're identifying boards with excellent practices that can be a model for other nonprofits, we're always looking at DEI as a component of what those boards are doing. All right, I'm gonna go a little bit over time for folks who have to drop off. You can access the recording after to catch up. I just wanna spend a minute on that training, evaluation, and improvement piece. So your governance committees focus really heavily and traditionally on that nominating function. I want to just highlight how important it is to also focus on training, evaluation, and improving governance within the organization. Regarding training, we want to make sure that new directors and committee members learn about the organization itself, but that they're also really trained on that second piece on the requirements and expectations of board service. When I'm looking at training materials for nonprofit boards, I don't often see enough emphasis on training people on what it exactly means to be a board member, what your fiduciary duties are, what our expectations are at the organization, what's in our board manual, what's in our board binder, and sort of this is a good opportunity to also just set the culture of the organization and of the board. So what do we expect around attendance and participation and reading the materials before the meeting? This is a good time to sort of set out those expectations at the training stage. Regarding evaluation, the governance committee should be creating surveys and self-assessments and conducting interviews and using other tools to look at the board's effectiveness and function. And this can be really granular. It can be like, are we the right size? Do we have the right skills and backgrounds? Are our attendance numbers looking good? Are folks properly engaged? Are our meeting mechanics in good order? Are the materials high quality? Are the agendas reasonable and appropriate? Are the facilitation of discussions, is that effective? And finally, looking at the board's ability to secure financial support and resources, always an important metric. In addition to evaluating the directors and the board as a whole, one important aspect that I want to point out here is that the governance committee should also be evaluating committees and periodically assessing the organization's overall committee structure, right? So common issues regarding committee structure can include committees that are sort of have unclear authority or that don't have work plans. So people are on those committees and they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing. On the other side, sometimes committees are doing too much and they have overlapping responsibilities with other committees or with the full board that can create inefficiencies or conflicts. Sometimes we have committees that are just not as relevant as they used to be, or that are not as active as they should be. And the governance committee is the place that should be kind of proposing, do we really need this committee? Could we dissolve it? Could we collapse it or integrate it into another committee? That's an important question to be asking. And then looking at issues regarding just committee leadership, processes or administration. And finally, the governance committee can be addressing opportunities or needs for additional committees at both the board level and the non-board level. So these are sort of strategic questions that someone should be asking your organization, and it's often the governance committee where that's most germane and appropriate to be asking these questions. Okay, that is all that I have. This is a bonus slide. We'll skip that. We are at the end of the presentation. I'm going to swing back and look at our, swing back and look at any questions that we have here in the chat. Again, thank you folks for staying on a little bit longer. Let's see here. What types of tax or finance tracking software do you recommend for nonprofits? I am not a finance person. I'm a lawyer, so I want to stay in my lane. What I will say is that it really depends on the size and sophistication of your organization. I work with a lot of really small nonprofits, and like QuickBooks is good enough for them. But as you get more sophisticated, your software needs are going to get more sophisticated, and also your need to hire bookkeepers and CPAs and other finance specialists will grow as well. So there's no one size fits all answer. One thing to look out for is to look forward at what sort of financial information you'll need to be reporting on, for example, your 990 or other financial reports, and then calibrating the software that you use and the tracking and accounting practices you have to meet those reporting burdens. So for example, if your organization is going to be filing a full Form 990, that requires you to provide a lot of financial information. It requires you to break out that financial information into functional categories, and it also requires you to break it out into sort of other kinds of fields. So you want to make sure that your software is up to the task of reporting what's going to be required on the full Form 990. Okay, other questions just about whether the webinar is being recorded. Yes, folks will get a recording. With that, I will be dropping off. Thank you everyone for coming by. Please check out the other resources that we have in our nonprofit resource library. That's the first link there. And we have a microsite with all of our resources regarding serving on the board. Please take a look at that microsite as well, including a link to all of our other board basics webinars. All right, thanks so much everyone. Take care.